Well, hello everyone, and welcome to our lesson on Chapter 11 of our textbook on film theory and criticism, which is basically a chapter where we shift our focus. So for the majority of the semester, we've been talking about various elements of meaning within that are within a film itself and that are manipulated by a director and a director's collaborators to produce meaning in a film. Then in Chapter 10, we actually discussed the economics and the business of filmmaking. So now we're going to look at finished films from a different lens. And this would be from the lens of somebody like me, somebody who writes about movies or teaches about movies and applies various critical perspectives, which we call critical theories, when I'm writing an analysis of a film, when I'm breaking down a film to attempt to show what the film means. So, the basic models of film theory that we have are what are called realist theory, auteurist theory, psychoanalytic theory, ideological theory, feminist theory, and cognitive theory. So, also, what's interesting is that the structure of this lesson, the order in which we'll discuss these various theories, roughly coincides with the order in which these theories start to become popular and start to become widely used by scholars who study film. So, prior to the development of any critical theory that a scholar could use to analyze a film, there was a widespread agreement among a lot of scholars, usually working in programs dealing with literatures and languages, during the period that we would call the golden age of period, the classical Hollywood period. So, when film is really developing as an art form and when it really corners the market as an art form. So we're talking about the 1920s, the 30s, and the 1940s. Film is considered by most people who study literature and languages and the arts to have really very, very little merit as an art form at all. Film is considered at its best to be merely mass-produced, mindless entertainment and not the work of an artist, because it is felt at that point in time, again in the 20s, 30s, and 40s, that in order to have a work of art needs to be the work of an artist. And as film is the result of these massive production companies, and these studios really were modeled on basically the idea of a factory assembly line, films were simply felt to be at their best, to be a mass-produced product, not deserving of being considered to be art. And at their worst, films were considered to be dangerous, because when scholars did look at film, they usually looked at how the medium of film, or when scholars looked at any mass media for that matter, not just film, but radio as well, and the press, what scholars looked at was, particularly in the 20th century, the example of how Hitler had very successfully used film and had very successfully used radio to get his message across. So, in this golden age of Hollywood, the 1920s, 30s, and 40s, film at its best is mass-produced, mindless schlock, not to be taken seriously by anyone, and at its worst is actively dangerous. So the first person to really come along and say, no, film has unique properties that make it valuable as an art form are a French critic named André Bazin. And Bazin felt that what made film important as an art form was that a degree of realism, the ability to capture real life, now existed as it never had before. So now only, not he sees film, cinematography, as an advance on photography, because whereas photography can capture a still image as it really appeared in the real world, cinematography can actually capture a moving image as it appeared in the real world. And what Bazin felt was that when an audience views a film, that there is sort of an ethical formulation between the audience and the makers of the film. There's a kind of contract, if you will, that the filmmakers need to understand, that the audiences will respond to the realism of the film, and that the filmmakers have a responsibility to render the world realistically. Bazin particularly felt the properties of film of deep focus cinematography and long takes that were used by specific directors like Jean Renoir and Orson Welles, and in long takes, long tracking shots in which a camera could be moved through an environment rather than just being planted statically so it could look an environment. He felt that these filmic techniques gave film a much greater degree of realism than any art form, and that this made film valuable. So, the strength of Bazin's approach, what makes Bazin's approach valuable is he is one of the first people to, through this ethical formulation that he talks about, he's one of the first people to talk about terms in the same terms in which people have talked about art classically. Now, from the ancient Greek period and in ancient Greek dramas, what were felt to be one of the qualities that great art had were what were called the classical unities of time, place, and action. That plays, unlike any other art form, could actually take place over a real amount of time. You would watch the action unfold in the same amount of time that it would in the real world at a fixed place, and that all of the action of the play would take place within that time in that one fixed place. And Bazin talks about film in very similar terms, whereas the ancient Greeks felt that the ultimate goal of art is what is called mimesis, or the imitation of life. Bazin felt film was valuable in exactly the same way, because it is capable of preserving these unities that the ancient Greeks so valued, and because it is so capable of meeting this goal of mimesis that the ancient Greeks valued. Film is therefore a very valuable art form. So the strength of Bazin's approach is that he actually sets the ground to talk about film as something like an art form. The weakness of Bazin's approach is that this realism, even at the time he was writing, there were a lot of films out there still that weren't realistic. There were lots of fantasy films. There were lots of films that were obviously playing games with realities, and the particular techniques he does admire, deep focus and long takes, they can coexist in the same film with montage editing, which Bazin felt was non-realistic. So, how can you praise a film for its use of deep focus and long takes in one scene, as we see in Citizen Kane, whereas in an earlier scene it relies on montage? So then you have to argue that part of the film is not realistic. But Bazin actually does create some sort of dialogue wherein film can start to be taken seriously as an art form. A case can be made that it does present some of the qualities of what has traditionally been considered to be art. Now, other realist models of filmmaking, as we talked about when we discussed modes of screen reality, are documentary realism. So the idea is that a film is attempting to present real events. There's also a very important movement, which we talked about in the film history lesson, called Italian neorealism. So you have a movement in Italian cinema of the early 1940s in which attempts to portray life as it is really lived by working class people, and often the setting of Italian neo-realist films is real neighborhoods where these people live. And we often talk about perceptual realism as the quality of film to convince the audience that the audience is experiencing either a real experience or as something that can be accepted as the reality of the moment, because film contains three-dimensional visual information. Even movies that are not 3D do at least give you an illusion of depth. You also have, especially with contemporary sound systems, you also have the same acoustic sound information happening around you. Cinema roughly conveys the same information for you to make sense of a film as the real world presents to you in everyday life to make sense of itself. However, this is constrained by cinema's transformative elements as well. When you're watching a superhero movie, you know that people don't really fly, and you know that the events that are taking place in front of you are plastered up on a screen in front of you, and they're not really happening. The real breakthrough happens in the late 1950s with the development of what is called the auteur theory and the auteurist theory. And basically what happened in France, there was a group of film critics who decided to launch one of the first really serious academic scholarly publications about films, and it was a magazine called Cahiers du Cinéma. And these film critics would write about films that they particularly admired, and would talk about the artistic qualities of these films. Many of these film critics, Jean-Luc Godard, François Truffaut, Jacques Rivette, Claude Jutra, many of these film critics would themselves go on and become filmmakers themselves. Jean-Luc Godard, particularly, is considered to be one of the world's most influential filmmakers. You don't often see his films in North America because they're considered to be too intellectual and too complex for a North American audience. Now, when these critics in the 1950s are writing for Cahiers du Cinéma, what they start to notice is that films directed by a certain director will have certain consistent elements. So, any Western films, for instance, directed by John Ford, the critics at Cahiers du Cinéma notice that there will always be a scene in which somebody is talking to or silently looking over a grave or a coffin which holds a dead person. Somebody will always find an excuse to sing the hymn, "Shall We Gather at the River?" And one of the themes will also be about the establishment of societies, the establishments of towns. When you look at the films of a director named Howard Hawks, the films are usually presenting either very, very tough, manly men and present the ways in which very, very tough, manly men interact with each other, or he's presenting very, very sort of weak, insignificant, comical men who are very easily manipulated by attractive women. And it was noticed that Ford is consistently presenting films that are about the issue of the establishment of communities. Hawks is consistently presenting films that explore masculinity. And what's important for the critics at Cahiers du Cinéma is that these people are making what are called genre films. They're not making films that are the types of movies that are trying to win Oscars or be or considered to be dramatically credible. They're making the kinds of movies that the studios get their bread and butter from. They're making westerns, they're making crime movies, they're making low comedies. So because of this, these directors at Cahiers du Cinéma come up with a theory called the auteur theory, or some call it the auteurist theory, and basically their proposition is that the director is the author of the film. So, and their evidence for that theory is that that directors consistently, the same director will consistently address the same issues and use the same stylistic techniques in their films. So what was great about the auteur theory is that it actually finally legitimized film as an art form. Remember, the objection against film as an art form is that for it to be an art form, you have to have it being the work of an individual artist. Film is mass-produced entertainment chucked off an assembly line, so it can't be the work of an individual artist. What the auteur theory did was it finally provided that individual artist. So, problems with the auteur theory is that, firstly, filmmaking is a collaborative effort. As we've been discussing all semester, the director, yes, coordinates all of the different elements of the film, but would Night of the Hunter have been the same film if it was photographed by a different person? Would The Conversation have been the same film if an actor other than Gene Hackman had played that part? So the auteur theory tends to ignore that filmmaking is collaborative and also occasionally makes attributional errors. To give you an example, the film, according to the auteur theory, the film Superman 2 is the work of a director named Richard Lester. Well, actually, the film Superman 2 was 80% completed by another director named Richard Donner. Richard Lester then shot 51% of the movie, and some of Richard Lester's footage was replaced with Richard Donner's footage, and Richard Lester was actually credited as the director of the film because Richard Donner basically got fired. So people were talking about how much they admired certain bits of Superman 2 and thought Richard Lester did such a good job on that bit of the movie. Richard Lester didn't actually direct that part of the movie. Many parts of Gone with the Wind were actually directed by a director named George Cukor, who also got fired because he wasn't getting along with the studio executives. The person credited with directing the film is a person named Victor Fleming. However, there's a lot in the movie which Victor Fleming did not personally direct. So there's a problem with giving the wrong people credit with the auteur theory. Now, in the 1960s, we start to see a lot of theories emerging from France based on theories around language and theories around the writings of Sigmund Freud. Sigmund Freud is the founder of the medical practice we now call psychiatry, and basically another scholar who worked in areas of language called Jacques Lacan took Freud's ideas and particularly Freud's concepts of what were called the id, the ego, and the superego, and he applied them to the analysis of language and how people call language. And what Lacan did was he reformulated Freud's ideas of the id, the ego, and the superego into what he calls the real stage of human development, the imaginary or mirror stage of human development, and the symbolic or language stage of human development. And Lacan's belief was that when people are born, we are born in a state of what he called the real. In that state, we have not yet differentiated ourselves from our environment. So we believe ourselves to be literally at one with everything. And Lacan argued that when we start to acquire language, we move into what he called the imaginary stage or the mirror stage. We now understand that we are a separate person. However, the person we understand ourselves is actually a gross distortion of how we understand ourselves. We basically think that we are the most important person in the whole universe and that everything and everybody else needs to revolve around us. And he calls this the mirror stage in the sense that when you go to a carnival and look at one of those warped mirrors, the image that you get is a complete distortion of yourself. It's not real. And Lacan believed that the final stage that we pass through when we reach adulthood is what he called the symbolic stage, when we acquire language. And then we understand that we have to participate effectively in a society. But Lacan felt that we miss that original sense of wholeness, of unity that we felt when we were back at the real stage, and that we want to return to the real stage. And what Lacan felt was that cinema activates unconscious, non-rational pleasures and anxieties. For instance, we engage in voyeurism. We look at taboo imagery, and some things become fetishized. And the reason that cinema does this is because we relive certain stages of our development in film. When we're watching a cartoon, for instance, or a children's film, and somebody gets reunited with their dog, and we feel wonderful and we go, ah, an argument could be made as that is we're returning to the real stage. And what that film has done is reactivated our experience of the real stage. One of the reasons why particularly boys who are in their late adolescence and early adulthood like action movies with figures like James Bond is because it's argued that these movies reactivate the mirror stage, that when young men see figures like James Bond in the movies, they identify with these figures. They feel that they can at least vicariously be James Bond, and as smart, as successful at dominating people, and as successful at attracting women as James Bond is. Whereas this is a completely warped distortion of their own desires. So it would be argued that cinema can reactivate the mirror stage. What's great about Lacan's theories is that it emphasizes that cinema is emotionally powerful, and it emphasizes that cinema can arouse strong emotions of desire and pleasure in people. The weaknesses, I would say, of Lacan's theory is that it tends to reduce cinema to a psychological experience, whereas often films are attempting to do more than that. We also start to see, roughly around the same times, that we see psychoanalytic models of film analysis becoming popular. We see ideological models of film analysis becoming popular. So in my own work, I do occasionally use psychoanalytic models. I will occasionally refer to the auteur theory. I will very occasionally refer to Bazin, but I will often refer to ideological models in my own work. And I will often read films ideologically. What ideological models look at are how films reflect certain beliefs about society and the world. How films portray society and express ideas about society, which we call ideological. Now, ideology and societal ideas, according to ideological models, are usually expressed at two levels. There's one order that is on the what is called the order of signs, which work through two processes called connotation and denotation. Connotation is when I use a word that has a specific concrete meaning. So, can here literally means an object I'm holding in my hand. That's my apologies. That's denotation, something that has a denotative meaning. You're using a word to describe something specific. Can. A connotative meaning is when the language we use to describe something has multiple layers of meaning. So, if I give someone a red rose, on a denotative level, it's a plant with red flowers at the end of it. It's got thorns, but on a connotative level, it's a symbol of love. So, some films work within this first order, signs which are connotation and denotation. A good example of this is the film Rambo: First Blood Part 2. This is a film made 10 years after the U.S. is defeated in Vietnam. And basically what happens is, in this movie, Rambo goes on a secret mission back to Southeast Asia and winds up singly taking on half of the Southeast Asian army and winning. This film is clearly expressing American anxieties and American humiliation over having lost the Vietnam War by creating a fantasy in which only one lone American needs to go back into Vietnam, and Vietnam can be cleaned up and the Americans can win. Another film that recently did this was the film Pearl Harbor, in which the Americans are presented as really winning the Battle of Pearl Harbor because they won the later battle. So this would be this first order level of ideological expression. It's very, very direct. Like those Friday the 13th horror movies that we see, in which every time a pair of teenagers goes somewhere to have sex, out comes Jason with a weapon and kills them. They're very, very direct in the social and political messages that they're sending. In the case of Rambo, it's expressing humiliation and a fantasy over the defeat in Vietnam. In the case of the Friday the 13th movies, it's very clearly saying bad things happen when teenagers have sex. Second order ideological expression isn't as direct. It usually involves presenting something in an idealized way that really may not have been all that wonderful. And two examples I give of that are the film Back to the Future, in which a young man in 1985 is transported back into 1955. And of course, 1955 is wonderful because life was so much simpler and everybody got along, etc., etc., etc. Small town USA really wasn't that pleasant a place to be in 1955, so the film is presenting us a myth, a sort of idealized America, to suggest certain things about the past and our history and who we are that aren't necessarily true. What we look for when we're doing an ideological reading of a film is how the film seems to offer either support for established social values or a critique of established social values. But often, you'll often find a lot of movies have very, very mixed messages. So they may be sending some messages which seem quite progressive. On the other hand, they may be sending other messages that seem quite reactionary. And this is because movies are attempting to apply to very large, very heterogeneous audiences. They're trying to please many different types of people, so they often try to send out many different kinds of messages. What's great about ideological models is that they emphasize the relationship of film to society, and they expose a distorted portrait of social issues. So after I've just talked about Friday the 13th movies in the way I just have, you probably aren't going to take them all that seriously anymore. The weakness is that the films themselves get reduced to their political message, and the issue of whether or not the film is a good film or a bad film gets put aside. There was a film made, 20 years ago now, called Armageddon, and I could write for hours on the political messages that are coming through in that film. It is an extremely political movie. It is almost radically political. It's also a really bad movie, so I've never bothered to write about it. And this was an issue with ideological models of film theory. They do tend to reduce films to ideological symptoms. Now, the book does do a specific case study on African American film and the development of African American film in the late 20th century. And what we found particularly was that there were very, very few African American stars in Hollywood before 1990. Hattie McDaniel did manage to win a Best Supporting Actress Oscar for her role in Gone with the Wind. Sidney Poitier had won a Best Actor Oscar, I believe. I actually forget which film it was, but he had won the Best Actor Oscar. But with those exceptions, you have very, very few African American directors in Hollywood before 1990. In the late 1980s, both Spike Lee with Do the Right Thing and John Singleton with Boys in the Hood emerge as major African American directors. Now, their projects tend to be aimed at very, very different audiences, and particularly with John Singleton, you tend to see a variety of projects, whereas most of Spike Lee's films, although Spike Lee's films do often switch genres, they do tend to be very, very politicized and contain many political messages. John Singleton with Boys in the Hood, yes, that film is very overtly political, but then he also goes to direct films like Shaft, which are more mainstream action movies. So, particularly with John Singleton's career, you see him doing a variety of projects aimed at different audiences. So, Shaft particularly is a mainstream product aimed at a mainstream audience. Spike Lee does get acceptance for most of his career with a mainstream audience, even though most of his films are political. In terms of actors, from the 1990s on, we start to see a very strong African American presence in Hollywood. Denzel Washington wins an Oscar, wins the Best Supporting Actor Oscar for his performance in a film named Glory in 1989. Halle Berry in, I think it was 2004 or 2005, wins the Best Actress Oscar for her performance in Monsters Ball. She is, by the way, the first African-American woman to win the Best Actress Oscar, and Denzel Washington finally follows up Sidney Poitier's Best Actor Oscar when he receives his Oscar for Training Day, again around the same time that Halle Berry receives her Best Actress Oscar for Monsters Ball. One of the reasons that you don't see a lot of black people participating in mainstream film is that mainstream film tends to have a long history of portraying racist attitudes towards black people. The Birth of a Nation, particularly, which is really the film responsible for what we now think of as the current feature-length film, up until the time The Birth of a Nation is released, I think around 1908. The average length of a movie is about 20 minutes or 30 minutes. My apologies, my dates were slightly off. Birth of a Nation was released in 1915. I was off by 7 years. What the film attempts to deal with is a realistic depiction of the recovery of the South after the Civil War. The director of the film, David Ward Griffith, swore up and down that he consulted historians, and most historians would, at the time, did agree that his presentation of the reconstruction of the South after the Civil War would be historically accurate and was an interpretation favored by most historians of the time. The film basically presents the South as destroyed by the Civil War, but thankfully the Ku Klux Klan came along and saved the day. So you can very easily figure out what the politics of this film are, and you can very easily figure out what the depiction of black people in the film is like. And this establishes, unfortunately, a long tradition of stereotype portrayals and racist portrayals of black people in Hollywood films. Even 30 years later, there's a film made in I think the early 1940s, with Errol Flynn and Ronald Reagan, yes, the Ronald Reagan that later became president, and Olivia de Havilland, who is actually still alive, called Santa Fe Trail, which depicts John Brown, who is trying to free slaves from the South, as an absolute monster, and actually has a scene towards the end of the film when Brown has been arrested, when the freed slaves admit that, we were sort of ungrateful because our masters at the plantations really looked after us very well, and we're going to go back to the plantations and hope our masters think we're sorry and let us work there again. I mean, it sounds absolutely incredible and absolutely appalling, but this was a standard portrayal of people of color in films at the time. What does happen is that you see, particularly through people like Oscar Micheaux, an African-American producer-director, an African-American film industry forms independently of Hollywood, and films get distributed in major cities to specifically an African-American audience. When you do see actors in the classical Hollywood period, when you do see people of color, I should say, in the classical Hollywood period from the 20s to the mid-1960s, they're mostly often in small supporting roles. They're often demeaning. They're portrayed as maids and servants, because most of the films of this era are about white characters who live in a white world. Sidney Poitier comes along in the mid-50s, and he actually becomes Hollywood's first black star. Now, remember that independent African-American film industry that I told you about, founded by Oscar Micheaux. By the late 1960s and early 1970s, this independent African-American film industry starts producing a genre of films, a movement in films known as blaxploitation. And this is where the first version of Shaft, directed by Barry Gordy, released in, I think, 1972, is part of this movement of blaxploitation. The John Singleton version of Shaft was released in 2000 and was actually an indirect sequel to the 1972 version. The 1972 version of Shaft itself had two sequels, Shaft's Big Score and Shaft in Africa. Most of the blaxploitation films are marketed to black audiences. They star black actors, and they are mostly crime films. So they're mostly dealing with fairly seedy people in fairly seedy situations. And for that reason, they were quite controversial at the time, because they were considered to be a not very flattering and a stereotypical portrayal, again, of black people. However, they do represent a real flourishing of African American theme films because they're popular not just with black audiences, they also become very, very popular with mainstream audiences as well, several of them, particularly Shaft and Superfly. We then start to see this new generation of black filmmakers which emerges in the 1990s. Again, Spike Lee, John Singleton, Tim Story, F. Gary Gray is another interesting director, and many of these filmmakers are now funded at the highest levels of the industry. So they're getting their funding from very established mainstream sources. Now, around about the same time that people start looking at political readings of film, they also we start to see feminist analyses of film start to become very popular among critics. And what feminist analysis of films look at is the depiction of gender in film. Now, most scholars will tell you that gender and biological sex refer to two different things. Someone's biological sex refers to whether or not they have male reproductive organs or female reproductive organs. Your gender refers to the role that you attempt to portray in society. So do you portray yourself according to a male gender role or a female gender role? So what feminist analysis of films look at is how images of women and men occur in films, how those images of women and men are connected to social ideologies, social beliefs, and social practices. And one of the primary assumptions of feminist criticism is that because mainstream cinema has been dominated by men, really throughout the classical Hollywood period and still right up to the present, although less so nowadays, what you get in films are not images of women as women are, but images of women as men perceive them, or often as men would like them to be. So, one thing that feminist models look at are how mainstream films, which are made chiefly by men and adopt chiefly a male perspective, present women. They also look at alternative forms of filmmaking, films made by women for women. Feminist films may also incorporate, criticisms of films may also incorporate psychoanalytic and ideological elements along with their feminist perspectives, and a particular, I guess, star of the feminist film critical movement, a founding theorist, is a woman named Laura Mulvey, and Laura Mulvey is famous for coining the phrase "to be looked atness." And what Laura Mulvey feels is that in films made in the classical Hollywood period, from again the 1920s to the 1960s and perhaps even the 1970s, when you see a woman on film, the woman is there to be looked at by men. And that is where Mulvey comes up with the phrase "to be looked atness." Because women are there to be looked at by men, she refers to women as the object of the gaze, and her proposition in her writing is that the camera adopts a male perspective. The camera is a male subject looking at a female object. So you can see that Mulvey, again, also incorporates some of the Lacanian influence around analysis of language. So when we're constructing sentences, we're concerned with subjects and objects. Mulvey posits the camera as a subject and what the camera views as an object. Strength of feminist readings is that they look at the ways that gender influences the production of images and the production of films, and they can emphasize very disruptive readings of a film that we may think to be a very good film. If we make a feminist reading of that film, we realize that there may be some issues with that film. Most recently, what we see development of are what are called cognitive models of film criticism. And what cognitive models of film criticism attempt to look at are how the viewer themselves perceive the visual information and the sound information that they're receiving from the screen with their brain. And basically, cognitive models of film criticism look at how your brain actually organizes the information that the movie is giving you and how your brain derives meaning from those visual images and sounds. And one of the things that cognitive film criticism finds is that, as cognitive psychologists find, that people, when they're processing any information that is coming to them, either visually or auditorily or through any of the sentences, we tend to apply schemas, these frameworks of interpretation based on our interpersonal experience, based on our personal experience through life. We tend to apply these schemas to any information coming in. So, for instance, if we hear that Joe is an unreliable person, and we're convinced that Joe is an unreliable person, any information that we receive about Joe from the time we become convinced that he's not a reliable person, we will try to make fit into that schema of Joe being an unreliable person. We may get loads of information telling us that Joe has behaved very reliably, and we will take that information and make it fit into our existing schema. We will say, but that's exactly what an unreliable person would do. An unreliable person would try to trick us into believing he's reliable. Therefore, this evidence that shows that Joe is reliable really shows he's unreliable. We develop, without realizing it, these frameworks through which we interpret any information that is coming in about the world to us, and we make the information fit in with what we already believe. These schemas, these frameworks that we force any information, any new information coming in to fit into, are our basis for our understanding of cinema. When we see images on screen, we try to make them fit in with images that we have already experienced in life. When we see social situations presented on screen, we try and make them fit in with our knowledge of social situations that we have already seen in life. Now, the strength of cognitive models of film criticism are that we can support the way people apply these schemas to films and react to films with empirical data. We can actually watch people's reactions. We can either observe people, we can actually hook people up to an MRI machine and look at what's going on in their brain, so we can actually support their reactions to film with hard data. We can also discuss why film is so popular by showing how that films are processed by the brain and how this is and how the response to films tends to make them more popular. All right, well, I hope you've enjoyed this overview of what I do when I'm writing about films, and please do let me know if you have any questions. Thank you.